Daniel here. Hope you're doing fantastic today. In this episode, I'm connecting with Nick Wignall. It is the first time ever that we actually speak. We connected on Twitter, and I had a funny feeling that we had a lot in common. But as you'll hear, I was really blown away by how we, independently of each other, had developed the exact same thoughts in relation to insomnia, the problems, and the best solutions in terms of like getting over insomnia. I think you can really listen to this from a pure human interest perspective, but more so, I hope you'll find a lot of deep insomnia insights in this episode. Enjoy. So with us today, we have Nick Wignall. Thanks so much for joining, Nick.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so me and Nick, we connected over Twitter, and then I remember, Nick, how I know you published on Medium, and I saw one of your articles, and I just saw the headline. It said, like, I can't sleep is an oxymoron. And just seeing that, I was like, wow, there's another one out there who thinks just like me.
Oh, yeah. Trying to sleep is an oxymoron, right?
Exactly. You know, I saw that. I was like, oh, yeah, there's other people with kind of the same mindset. So, and we'll get back to that in a second. But just let us know, like, your background and how you got into insomnia.
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing for about 4 years now. And I got into insomnia initially, actually, because right out of grad school, the place I was hired on to work at, my boss is the editor for a journal, and he asked if I would do a book review for this journal, and I said sure, and I had no idea what the book was, and it was a book called, I think it was called Treatment Plans and Interventions for Insomnia. It was like a clinician's manual for treating insomnia, but it was written by two really great sleep researchers and clinicians, Colleen Carney and Rachel Manberg. And I read this book, and it was like, the book was an aha moment.
Yeah.
I had no idea that, I think insomnia had maybe come up once or twice in all of grad school. And then it was only in passing, but I had no idea that it was, that it was such a problem, and B, that there was such an amazingly effective, relatively straightforward treatment for it. And so after reading that book and just being fascinated by it and reviewing it, I was hooked. So I started to go, every time I went to a conference, I just tried to get in all the workshops I could on CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and just read everything I could and started slowly taking on clients with insomnia. I do primarily anxiety is what I work with in therapy, but I started taking on more insomnia clients specifically. And so it's just kind of developed into a niche specialty in terms of my work, but also just a real kind of passion in terms of something that is, insomnia is such a big problem, and we have such a great solution, really cure for it, that almost nobody knows about. And it blows my mind every time I think about it. So
absolutely. I think about that all the time. So actually, let's talk about that. So, you and I both know, millions of people have insomnia. CBTI is very effective. But in your mind, like, what are the main reasons why, like, nobody's heard about it?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I hate to sound overly kind of skeptical, but part of my thought is that the pharmaceutical industry got a jump on treating insomnia. And so, there have been a lot of drugs out there. And traditionally, before we had behavioral treatments for insomnia, drugs were that's what people did. They just, they took various drugs. Of course, we have kind of Ambien and a lot of the hypnotics these days. But I feel like pharmaceuticals just kind of got the first jump, and then we haven't really done a great job of kind of marketing ourselves and being assertive about the idea of, behavioral and cognitive approaches to treating insomnia.
100%. I feel like, in the medical field, we have totally let down, people with insomnia. In the medical field, I feel it hasn't really been acknowledged as a medical problem. People kind of like, there's hardly any education about it. And it sounds to me, as in the kind of psychological realm, similarly, that you don't get much education about it, sounds like.
No. I mean, again, it was non-existent in my training, any sort of, thinking about insomnia at all, much less cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Yeah, just really totally absent. And I don't know that I I had never and still have never encountered any other medical professional who primary care physicians, pediatricians, even sleep medicine doctors who know about cognitive behavioral therapy and for insomnia, which is wild because all the major medical associations recommend in their treatment guidelines recommend CBTI as the first line treatment for chronic insomnia.
100%.
So again, it's pretty wild. The other thing I would say too is while CBTI is a very effective and in some ways pretty straightforward treatment that can work quite quickly, it's not necessarily easy. And the idea of just taking a pill to help you fall asleep, it's a lot easier sounding. So I think in some ways pills are an easier sell. That doesn't excuse the fact that we need to be a lot better about advocating for CBTI. But I think that's another component of it too, is to shift the mindset that working through insomnia is going to be more analogous to working with a coach to get in shape at the gym than it is to just go to the doctor and get a pill, get some antibiotics for an infection you have.
I agree with you 100%. Like I think it's both. It's a hard sell for kind of the person selling it, because like it's not easy to like, it's you cannot put education and support and things like that into a pill and give it to somebody, which would be easy. So it's kind of a hard sell on that end. It's hard to accept. And by the way, just on a side note here, like when I look for, let's say I have a problem and I look for a YouTube video to solve it, I always look for the shortest one, the one that's 20 seconds. So we all look for that, like the shortest way to solve a problem. So I 100% get that. Now, as we're speaking here, like going back to that like initial article I read from you, like I can't sleep is an oxymoron. Can you develop? You remember that article? I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, sure.
Can you develop that thought?
Yeah. So the title of the article was "Trying to Sleep is an Oxymoron," and I wrote it to be kind of a deliberately contrarian piece because there's in some ways it's very well intentioned. There's a lot of messaging and media around the idea of how important sleep is and getting good sleep. And so it's become this real big sort of lifestyle push to try and get good sleep, to really focus on it as a goal and something to aspire to and really work hard at, not unlike, exercising or building a business or any of these other things that sort of we aspire to culturally. And so at first blush, that it makes sense. Like, oh yeah, sleep's important, obviously. And so important things we should try hard. We should sort of strive after if they're important. And that, 98% of the time in life, that works. Working hard and trying effortfully to do things, it gets us better grades in school. It gets us better job reviews, in our work. The effort solves a lot of problems in life. But there's this really small set of phenomena in life, and sleep is one of them, where not only does effort not work, it completely backfires.
Right, exactly.
And so the image I like for this is most people are familiar with what's called the Chinese finger trap, which is this thing you put it's this little tube and you put your fingers into it, and then it tightens around your fingers as soon as they go in. And the harder you try to pull out, the tighter the tube gets around your fingers.
Yeah.
And the paradoxical thing is you actually have to push your fingers in, which is totally counterintuitive, in order for the tube to kind of relax and for your fingers to be able to. So I think sleep is a lot like that. It's in any sort of this, one of the ideas that I think is most underappreciated in all of sleep and insomnia is what's called sleep effort, which is this idea that you need to try to sleep. You need to apply effort in order to get good sleep. And it's just it's not only is it wrong, it's actually harmful. It's counterproductive, because the more you try to do anything, whether it's studying for a test or running on the treadmill or laying in bed trying to fall asleep, what you signal to your brain is go into work mode, like activate, go up, which of course is great if you're running a marathon or if you're studying for a test. But if you're trying to fall asleep, it's going to do the exact opposite, activating, arousing yourself through effort, striving, trying hard. It ends up doing the very thing you're trying to avoid, which is keeping you up at night.
100%. You're just blowing my mind. Like everything you're talking about is like things I ponder all the time myself. And speaking of that, I feel like uh, you know, please comment on this. Like what I feel kind of the most challenging part of CBTI is you're telling somebody you have to do this and this and this and that, which is often very hard. But then at the same time, you tell them, but don't think about
But
sleep.
don't
Don't
think
focus,
about it.
right?
Right. Yeah,
Do you feel that way?
totally. It's really, really tricky. And in fact, I've even, for that very reason, I try to be really careful and think about, I think certain people are more or less susceptible to this, the sort of the paradox of effort. Like some people are just really wired kind of to really strive and try hard.
Yeah.
And they have a really hard time not mentally and behaviorally going 100% after a goal. They're very goal oriented.
Yeah.
So like one kind of surprising thing I'll do sometimes is with people who are extremely goal oriented, I'll really tone down the structure of my implementation of CBTI. So for instance, this sounds heretical to a lot of people, but sometimes I won't even do sleep diaries. Like I won't even recommend sleep diaries to people because it's too, or they get obsessed with it and they sort of get like just stuck on it. And it becomes this another big thing to think about and to do when it comes to their sleep. So I think an important point there is you really have to tailor the intervention to your client, to whomever you're working with, because you're totally right that it's so easy to slip into effort and trying harder and problem solving because that's what we do all day long and that's what we get rewarded for and reinforced for. So it's incredibly hard to shift out of that mode when you need to.
I agree with you 100%. And I can see that client in front of me that you're describing, the person that, always been very successful, always reading the goals and targets. And like, this is the one time in life where they have to like do the complete opposite, which can be so difficult. Now, I had I just had like a question about that was going to be, but anyway, let's come back to that in a second.
Sure.
So, I was going to ask you, I think I mentioned before coming on here, like if you pick this like one thing, and you might have already said this, but if you could pick one thing that you feel is like maybe something underrated, your like insomnia insight, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that it's fairly well known, I think, among CBTI clinicians. So no one in that audience is going to be surprised to hear this, but among the general public, the idea of sleep effort, this thing we've sort of been talking about, that you trying hard to sleep and thinking a lot about and putting a lot of effort and generally striving to sleep is totally counterproductive. So you have to figure out ways to do this sort of ninja zen trick of following the rules but not really thinking about the rules. And I think to me that's where the behavioral parts of CBTI come in really handy, which is one of the little sort of mantras I give my clients is the general approach to all the things we talk about in CBTI and in terms of working through insomnia. They should follow the principle of set it and forget it. So you kind of have a certain. So let's say you're talking about your schedule. You're doing some sleep restrictions, some time in bed restriction, and you're going from your plan is to not get into bed until midnight and to get up at 6 in the morning.
Yeah.
Right? The thing you want to do is you want to be like a robot. You want to program that in, and then that's the rule, and you just don't think about it. And you just sort of follow the routine like a robot who's been programmed. So At the beginning, there is a lot of psychoeducation. There's a lot of kind of routines and sort of protocols you have to kind of internalize. The trick is to be aware of them, but to not to avoid the temptation to tinker with them, to kind of question them, and you just set it and you forget it. And so routines are incredibly important, I think, really in good sleep. You look at good sleepers, they tend to have good sleep routines. Right. It's just something they do automatically. But routines have the benefit. I think that's the best way fundamentally to get around this problem of sleep effort. So you do spend a little time thinking through things carefully and making a plan, but then once you have it, you want to just really just follow the plan almost kind of blindly.
Exactly.
Which again is something that's a very like countercultural idea, I think, that we all tend to resist a little bit, but it's the thing that works in the long run, I've found.
100%. Set it and forget it. That's a really good one. And I just remember like what I was gonna ask you before, which is the following. Like, it's funny, like what you talked about, how you have to kind of tailor your CBTI based on, the personality
Mm-hmm.
of your client. Something I've been pondering lately is like, is there a way to like predict like what type of CBTI a client needs? Like maybe even before you start seeing them, like having some kind of questionnaire, and then you can tell by the answers like, oh, this person is gonna do really well on kind of like the militant CBTI. Like you have to do
Right.
this, you have to do that. This other person will be like, no, this person is gonna be like, we're not gonna set much rules, and like, do you think that could be predicted somehow?
That's a great question. I think yes, I think it probably could. I would love to see somebody kind of try that and try and formulate some sort of a questionnaire to kind of tease that apart. Because I definitely see different flavors or subtypes of my insomnia. So like a common type of client is someone who has basically just gotten into bad habits around sleep. So
Yeah.
they're sleeping in a lot. They have like really variable kind of bedtimes. Their routines are kind of all out of whack. And that's the kind of person where you can sort of just give them a pretty straight playbook. And if you do good psychoeducation at the beginning and they buy in, they're usually will just kind of set it and forget it. They'll kind of follow the rules and their sleep will straighten out.
Yeah.
To me, the harder one is the people who are more heady about their insomnia. And these are the people for whom you know, this is again another kind of controversial point, but I think you can make the case that at least for a lot of people with insomnia, it's actually better conceptualized as an anxiety disorder than as a sleep disorder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the reason is just like chronic worry is the thing that in various different manifestations and forms produces chronic anxiety in people with anxiety disorders. Um, People with insomnia just think a lot about sleep and they
100%.
worry a lot about their sleep and getting bad sleep and what the effects of bad sleep will be. So there's a certain variant of insomnia client who I almost treat it more like I would treat an anxiety disorder. And so it tends to be a little bit more cognitive. It involves things that kind of look like exposures that you would do for like someone with a phobia or something like that. So I feel like I could riff on this all
Yeah,
night
no,
long,
this,
but
this is really good. Like,
it's a
tell
great
me more about
question.
this. Yeah.
About what in particular?
No, no, this whole the exposure. Can you tell a little bit more? What does that entail?
So a big phenomenon. I haven't heard anyone else really talk about it, and that's probably just my own ignorance. I'm sure there are people who've talked about this, but there's a subset of my clients who their insomnia started when they had a really bad bout of sleeplessness. Something happened. Maybe it was a death in the family or some kind of major medical illness that just made it really hard to sleep. And they had like a few nights in a row of brutal, maybe they only got 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night. And it was just really rough. And then what happened is I think of this as kind of a sleep trauma. It's their first experience with a really harsh insult to their sleep. And of course, like a lot of people with trauma, they react in this very particular way, which is to see it as this threat to their very survival. And so what they start doing is they go into fight or flight mode. They start trying to fix their insomnia, or they start trying to avoid anything associated with insomnia. And of course, just like PTSD or any kind of anxiety disorder, that avoidance and that worry just exacerbates, it just reinforces the fear and keeps people more and more aroused, and therefore they have a harder and harder time falling asleep. So a lot of times what you have to be able to show people is, without engaging any sort of mechanism or strategy or any sort of goofy rituals or routines or anything, you can sleep really poorly and you're gonna feel rough, but you will sleep. Your body knows how to sleep. It wants to sleep. It's about trusting that your body can sleep without any input from you. Which is very much the same thing you do with classical exposure. You're essentially teaching people when you get anxious, when you start feeling panicky, you don't have to do anything, and your anxiety, your panic will actually go away on its own, right? But it's when you start running away from it and trying to fight it, that's what reinforces the idea that anxiety is dangerous and bad for you. And so similarly, when people stay in this heightened state of anxiety around their sleep or their sleeplessness, they're reinforcing this false belief that lack of sleep is dangerous, right? That only getting 4 hours of sleep means they're losing brain cells, or like, something awful is going to happen. And so you have to be able to teach people, you know what, you can have really crummy nights of sleep. You can have a couple really crummy nights of sleep, and you're not going to feel great, but you're going to recover. Your body's going to do it. Your body knows how to do this. If you miss some deep sleep one night, you're going to recover that deep sleep the next night, and you're going to be all right. You're going to survive. And once people really start to trust that their bodies can handle sleep on their own, that's when really big improvements tend to happen for this particular type of insomnia client.
No, absolutely. Yeah, this is an amazing conversation. It's so enlightening. You have so much deep insight here. And you know what's so interesting is like, I think, to my other colleagues like Michael Schwartz and Martin Reed, like we met one time like a couple of months ago, and we talked about how we approach things. And the funny thing I think is in the CBTI world is we are all kind of isolated. We don't really talk to each other. So when I hear you talk like that, I'm like, wow, this is like radical stuff. Like I never heard about this. It's interesting. And the same thing with Michael when he talked. I was like, wow, I never thought about it this way. This is so cool. And listen, I want to share this one with you. I think you'll appreciate it.
Sure.
How old? You have kids, right?
Yeah, young kids. They're 3.5 and 2.
Got it. So maybe they're a little young to this, but I read the other night. I read this. The old lady who swallowed a spider. You know that one?
No.
Okay. So briefly, it's like this old lady, right? She randomly swallows a spider. Okay. No, she swallows a fly. Sorry. Then to get hold of that fly, she swallows a spider, but doesn't solve it. So she then swallows a bird. Okay. And then a cat, and then a dog, etc. Finally, she swallows a horse, and she like just collapses. And I was like, this is just like insomnia. Like, swallowing the fly was actually not a big problem, but the fact that she's trying to solve it so hard, like by swallowing that becomes the problem, right?
Right. Yep. No, absolutely. And that's kind of why I tend to think of chronic insomnia more. It follows the dynamics and the mechanics of an anxiety disorder almost perfectly. The idea that the harder you try to fight it or to run away from it, the worse it gets. And paradoxically, you have to be willing to just confront it and let it be. And that's the way to lower your arousal and end up kind of being able to actually let your body do what it wants to do, which is fall asleep.
That's awesome. Really, really cool. So I would just want to ask you like a few more questions. One was like, tell me more like how what's your practice like? How long do you usually spend with patients, and how many sessions do you usually do for people with insomnia?
Yeah, so clients with insomnia, I'll do an initial intake, which is about, they fill out some forms and questionnaires and stuff, and then I'll meet with them for about an hour, and maybe a little bit longer, just depending on their history. And then we'll go into the first. I have to say I've gotten pretty streamlined at my initial kind of psychoeducation, and I can get just about everything into the first maybe 50-minute session. So explaining everything from sleep drive and arousal and circadian signaling and then kind of talking and sleep cycles and kind of giving them all the basic kind of information that they need.
Yeah.
And I've found that if I can do that in a way that's compelling for the individual client, that's 80% of my work is done at that point.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's usually another, again, I'd say between maybe 2 and 6 sessions of kind of implementing the actual kind of strategy and plan.
Yeah.
And usually at that point, the vast majority of people have seen pretty significant progress, to the point where a good number of people kind of stop there and say, thanks, see you later. I'll call you if I need anything else. And then another kind of group of people say, this has been great. I'm going to go to, maybe we'll meet once a month or something just to kind of check in periodically, or they'll move to working on a different unrelated problem to insomnia. But that probably covers 80% of my insomnia clients. There's some who have with if there are people who have really complex medical conditions or other kind of psychopathology or substance abuse stuff, that can obviously make things a little trickier
Sure.
and make progress slower. But that's a pretty standard timeline for the way. And another thing, a lot of the protocols for insomnia are have you meet every other week with people. And I did that at first, but I have really found that meeting weekly right off the bat is really helpful for people to just really hit stuff hard right away, and then pretty quickly taper off. So that's one thing I'd be curious to see what other people do. I've just found that tends to work best for a lot of my clients. But
that sounds like, I have the same experience. Like I feel like the initial conversation is super important, but then I want to see somebody in like almost weekly for like 2 to 3 times, and then usually taper. That's mirrors my experience very much. Very, very cool. Like this has been super great talking to you, and I hope you'll come on some other time, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, you take care.
All right, bye.